The night Illyra Voss turned 17, the world burned around her in shades of crimson and ash. She stood in the ruins of what had once been her family's modest stone cottage on the outskirts of the capital city of Blackspire, watching flames consume the last physical evidence that she had ever been loved. The fire crackled with a hunger that seemed almost sentient, licking at timber beams and devouring the few possessions her parents had managed to accumulate over their short, struggling lives. The heat pressed against her face like angry hands, but Illyra could not move, could not breathe, could not do anything but stand and witness the end of everything she had known. Her mother had died 3 days prior, wasting away from the gray fever that swept through the lower districts every winter like clockwork, taking the poor and the weak as though culling a herd. Her father had followed within hours, his heart simply stopping as he sat beside the cold body of his mate, unable to survive the severing of their bond. Illyra had been left alone in a world that had never been kind to her, an orphan at 17 with no coin, no connections, and no future beyond the servitude that awaited all unmarked Omega girls of her station. She had not set the fire herself. That distinction belonged to the village elders' men, who had come at dawn with torches and an official decree stamped with the High Council's seal. The decree stated that the property was to be seized for unpaid taxes, a lie so transparent it was almost insulting. Her father had paid every copper he owed, scraping together the funds by working himself to exhaustion in the tannery. But the truth did not matter in Blackspire, not for people like Illyra and her family. The truth was a luxury afforded only to those with power, with voice, with the protection of higher bloodlines. The men had given her 10 minutes to gather what she could carry. Illyra had stumbled through the cottage in a daze, her hands shaking as she reached for her mother's shawl, her father's wood-carving knife, a small leather journal filled with her own clumsy attempts at poetry. But before she could even tie the bundle closed, the first torch had been thrown through the window, and the cottage had erupted into an inferno. The men had laughed as she ran into the street, empty-handed and screaming, her cries swallowed by the indifferent morning air. Now, as the sun set on that same day, Illyra stood alone in the growing darkness, watching the embers settle into silence. Her throat was raw from screaming, from begging, from pleading with neighbors who had turned their backs and shuttered their windows. No one would help an orphaned Omega. No one would risk the displeasure of the Elder or the Council. She was nothing, less than nothing. A girl without family or fortune in a city that devoured the weak. It was in that moment, as the last flame flickered and died, that Illyra felt it. A sudden, violent pull deep in her chest, as though someone had reached inside her ribcage and wrapped a fist around her heart. She gasped, stumbling forward, her hand flying to her sternum. The sensation was overwhelming, a mixture of pain and longing so intense it drove her to her knees on the cold cobblestones. Heat flooded through her veins, pooling low in her belly, and a scent filled her nostrils, rich and dark like pine smoke and winter storms. It was a scent that did not belong to this street, to this moment, to anything in her small, shattered world. The bond, the fated bond. Illyra had heard the stories, whispered among the Omega women in hushed, reverent tones. The bond that connected an Omega to their destined Alpha, a connection forged by the moon goddess herself, unbreakable and absolute. It was said to be a blessing, a gift, the one promise of happiness and security that even the lowest Omega might receive. But Illyra felt no blessing in the agony that gripped her now. She felt only terror, because she knew, with a certainty that transcended logic or reason, that her destined mate was no ordinary Alpha. The power that radiated through the bond was immense, ancient, suffocating. It pressed down on her like the weight of mountains, like the authority of kings. And in a city ruled by King Raedric Thorn, the Alpha King of the High Clans, there was only one Alpha whose presence could feel like this. No, it was impossible. The king did not bond with orphaned Omegas from the slums. The king did not even look at girls like Illyra, girls with dirt under their nails and hunger in their bellies. The king took carefully selected mates from the noble houses, Omegas groomed and educated, and presented like offerings to ensure political alliances and strong bloodlines. The bond had to be a mistake, a cruel trick of fate or fever or grief-induced madness. But the pull did not relent. It grew stronger with each passing second, dragging her awareness toward the center of the city, toward the towering obsidian fortress of Blackspire Keep, where the king held court. Elira could feel him there, could sense the shape of his presence like a shadow cast across her soul. And worse, far worse, she could feel the exact moment when he felt her in return. The bond snapped taut between them, a living thing, and Elira heard a sound that was not a sound, a wordless roar of recognition and possession that reverberated through her bones. He knew. The king knew she existed, and he would come for her. Panic seized Elira with claws sharper than any blade. She lurched to her feet, her legs trembling, her vision swimming with black spots. She had to run. She had to disappear before he found her, before he claimed her, before she became a pawn in whatever games the High Council and the king played with the lives of their subjects. Because Elira knew, even in her terror, that an orphaned Omega bonded to the king was not a fairy tale. It was a liability. It was a scandal. It was a problem to be quietly removed. She had overheard the whispers, even in her sheltered life, the council's quiet decrees about Omegas whose bloodlines were deemed unsuitable, whose existence posed political complications. They disappeared, those Omegas. They were sent to distant convents or married off to cruel alphas in far provinces, or they simply vanished in the night, their names erased from records as though they had never been born. Elira would not let that be her fate. She would not be erased. With shaking hands, she pulled the hood of her worn cloak over her hair and turned away from the smoldering ruins of her home. The streets of Blackspire were a maze of narrow alleys and crooked lanes, and Elira had spent her childhood learning every hidden corner, every shadow where a small, quiet girl could disappear. She moved quickly now, keeping her head down, her scent suppressed as much as she could manage despite the bond that screamed through her blood. She had to get out of the capital. She had to get far away before the king sent his guards, before the council learned of the bond, before everything she feared came crashing down upon her. Elira made her way to the northern gate, the one used by merchants and laborers heading to the border cities. The guards there were lazy, bored, more interested in their dice games than in scrutinizing the faces of every beggar and worker who passed through. She slipped past them in a crowd of factory workers heading home after the evening shift, her thin frame lost among the tired bodies, her presence unremarkable, forgettable. Once beyond the city walls, Elira walked through the night, her feet blistering in her worn boots, her lungs burning with cold air. She did not stop until dawn broke over the frozen fields, painting the snow in shades of pale gold and pink. Only then did she allow herself to collapse beneath a bare oak tree, her body shaking with exhaustion and shock. The bond still thrummed inside her, a constant ache, but the distance had dulled its intensity. She could think again. She could breathe. For 3 days, Elira traveled north, hitching rides on supply wagons, walking when no rides were available, stealing scraps of food from farm kitchens and sleeping in barns. She avoided other travelers, kept her eyes down, and spoke to no one. By the time she reached the city of Carn Hollow, she was gaunt and hollow-eyed, her clothes filthy, her hair matted with sweat and dirt. She looked like 100 other displaced Omegas, refugees from poverty or violence, drifting from city to city in search of work or mercy. Carn Hollow was a place where people came to disappear. It sat on the northern border of the High Clan's territory, a gray, crumbling city built on trade and smuggling, and the kind of willful ignorance that allowed criminals and outcasts to thrive. The buildings were old and listing, their stone facades blackened by centuries of coal smoke. The streets stank of fish and industrial waste, and the air was perpetually damp with fog rolling in from the nearby mountains. It was not a kind place, not a beautiful place, but it was a place where no one asked questions, and that was all Elira needed. She found work on her second day in the city, a position as a night archivist in the Royal Record Hall, a vast, neglected building on the edge of the administrative district. The record hall was a repository for old documents, tax ledgers, genealogies, and forgotten legal texts, and it was so poorly maintained that most of the records were crumbling to dust. The pay was abysmal, barely enough to afford a corner in a shared room above a bakery, but the work was solitary and required no interaction with others. It was perfect for someone who needed to hide. The first night Elira reported for her shift, she was met by the senior archivist, a hunched beta man named Torvin who smelled of pipe tobacco and mildew. He looked her over with rheumy eyes, taking in her ragged appearance and obvious youth, and grunted his approval. "You'll do," he said, his voice rough with phlegm. "Can you read?" Elira nodded. "Can you write?" Another nod. Torvin squinted at her. "You mute, girl." Elira hesitated, then nodded again. It was not true, not yet. But in that moment she made a decision that would define the next 7 years of her life. She would not speak. She would not give anyone a reason to remember her, to look too closely, to ask questions. Silence would be her shield, her camouflage, her survival. Torvin shrugged, uninterested. "Fine by me. Less chatter, more work. You'll catalog the records in the East Wing. No one goes there anymore. Just dust and rats. You'll work midnight to dawn, 6 nights a week. Don't steal anything, don't burn anything, and don't let anyone in without my permission. Understand?" Elira nodded a third time, and Torvin waved her toward a narrow staircase that descended into the bowels of the record hall. "Go on then. Your workspace is down there. Don't expect help. Don't expect company. And don't expect sympathy if you fail. We've had 3 archivists quit this year already. This place eats the weak." Elira descended into the darkness, her hand trailing along the damp stone wall, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. This was her new life. This was her hiding place. And as long as she remained silent, remained invisible, she might just survive. The East Wing of the record hall was as desolate as Torvin had promised. It was a labyrinth of narrow corridors lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of rotting ledgers and mold-stained scrolls. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, and the only light came from a few sputtering oil lamps that cast long, wavering shadows across the stone floor. Elira's workspace was a small alcove at the far end of the wing, furnished with a rickety desk, a stool, and a stack of blank cataloging sheets. She set to work immediately, losing herself in the mindless task of sorting and recording. The records were a chaotic jumble of administrative minutiae: birth certificates from decades past, tax assessments, property deeds, legal disputes. Most were illegible, the ink faded or smeared, the parchment eaten by insects. But Elira worked with meticulous care, her hands steady, her mind focused. The work was a refuge from thought, from memory, from the bond that still pulsed faintly in the back of her consciousness like a distant drumbeat. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Elira lived in a state of suspended existence, neither truly living nor truly dead. She went to work each night, returned to her small room each morning, ate her meager meals in silence, and slept fitfully through the daylight hours. She spoke to no one. She made no friends. She attended no festivals or markets. She became a ghost, a shadow, a name in a ledger that no one would ever read. The bond never fully faded. It was always there, a faint ache beneath her ribs, a whisper in her blood. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, she would feel a surge of emotion that was not her own: anger, frustration, loneliness, grief. She knew it came from him, from the king, from the mate she had abandoned. She wondered if he had searched for her, if he had mourned the bond's incompleteness, if he had moved on. She told herself she did not care. She told herself she had made the right choice. But the bond knew the truth, and it punished her for her lies with its relentless, aching presence. By the time Elira turned 24, she had been in Carn Hollow for 7 years. She had carved out a fragile, solitary existence, and she had almost convinced herself that she could live this way forever. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It began with a rumor, whispered among the day staff of the record hall. There had been a coup attempt in the capital, a failed uprising by a faction of noble alphas who sought to overthrow King Redrick and place one of their own on the throne. The attempt had been crushed with brutal efficiency, and the conspirators had been executed in the public square of Blackspire. But the king, it was said, had not been satisfied with blood alone. He wanted answers. He wanted to root out every thread of the conspiracy to ensure that no ember of rebellion remained. To that end, the king had ordered a comprehensive review of the royal archives, including the neglected records in the border cities. Genealogies had to be verified, bloodlines confirmed, loyalties documented. It was a monumental task, one that would require months of work and the cooperation of every record hall in the kingdom. And it meant that Carn Hollow, for the first time in decades, would receive direct attention from the capital. Illyra heard the news with a creeping sense of dread. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was too insignificant to attract notice, that the king himself would never set foot in a place like Carn Hollow. But the bond, dormant for so long, stirred in her chest like a waking beast. She felt him growing closer, felt the pull intensifying with each passing day, and she knew with cold certainty that her time in hiding was coming to an end. The king arrived in Carn Hollow on a gray, rain-soaked morning in late autumn. Illyra was asleep when his entourage rode through the city gates, but she woke with a gasp, her heart racing, her skin slick with sweat. The bond was a roaring wildfire in her chest, so intense it stole her breath and left her shaking. He was here. He was in the city, and he was looking for something. Illyra dressed with trembling hands, pulling on her shapeless gray work dress and tying her hair back in a severe bun. She wrapped her mother's old shawl around her shoulders, a thin barrier against the cold and against the terror that clawed at her insides. She could not run. There was nowhere left to run. All she could do was cling to her silence, to her invisibility, and pray that the king's business in Carn Hollow would not bring him to the record hall. But the gods, it seemed, were not inclined to answer the prayers of orphaned Omegas. That evening, as Illyra descended into the east wing for her shift, she found Torvin waiting for her at the top of the stairs, his face pale and his hands shaking. "There's been a change," he said, his voice thin and strained. "The king's men are here. They're inspecting the archives. They want access to the genealogical records, the old bloodline documents. I told them most of it's down in the East Wing, that you're the one who knows where everything is. They want you to assist them." Illyra stared at him, her mouth dry, her pulse thundering in her ears. She shook her head frantically, gesturing toward her throat, miming her muteness. Torvin waved her protests away. "I don't care if you're mute, girl. You can write, can't you? That's all they need. Just show them where the records are. Help them find what they're looking for and stay out of their way. And for the love of the goddess, don't do anything to embarrass this hall. The king himself is overseeing the inspection. If you make trouble, it's my head on the block." The king himself. The words echoed in Illyra's mind like a death knell. She wanted to refuse, to flee, to do anything but go down into that archive and face the mate she had spent 7 years running from. But she had no choice. Refusal would draw attention, questions, scrutiny. All she could do was obey and hope that the bond could be hidden, suppressed, ignored. She descended into the east wing on legs that felt like water, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The lamps had been lit, their light brighter than usual, and she could hear voices echoing down the stone corridors. Deep male voices, confident and commanding. She forced herself to keep walking, to keep breathing, to keep moving forward even though every instinct screamed at her to turn and run. When she rounded the corner into the main archive chamber, she saw them. A half-dozen men in the dark crimson uniforms of the King's Guard, rifling through shelves and stacking documents on tables. And standing in the center of the room, his back to her, was the king. Raedric Thorn was a towering figure, easily a head taller than the tallest of his guards. His shoulders were broad beneath the black fur cloak that draped across his frame, and his hair, dark as midnight, was pulled back from a face that Illyra could not yet see. But she did not need to see his face to know him. The bond recognized him instantly, screaming his identity through every fiber of her being. This was her mate. This was the Alpha who had haunted her dreams and her waking hours for 7 years. This was the man she had run from. And now, at last, there was nowhere left to run. Redrick turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for the first time in 7 years, Elira looked into the eyes of the king. He was 32 years old, but his face bore the weight of a much longer life. It was a hard face, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and a mouth set in a permanent expression of stern authority. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter storms, and they held a coldness that made Elira's blood run ice. This was not a man who smiled easily, who forgave easily, who loved easily. This was a man forged in war and politics, a man who had learned to rule through strength and fear. But as his gaze locked onto hers, something shifted in those cold gray eyes. They widened, just a fraction, and Elira saw shock flicker across his face. Shock, and then a dawning, terrible recognition. He felt it too. The bond. After 7 years of silence and distance, the bond roared to life between them, and Redrick Thorne staggered back a single step, his hand flying to his chest as though struck. The room fell silent. The guards stopped their work, turning to look at their king with confusion and concern. One of them stepped forward, his hand moving toward his sword. "Your Majesty, are you—" "Get out." Redrick's voice was a low, dangerous growl, and every man in the room obeyed instantly, filing out of the chamber without question or hesitation. Within seconds, Elira and the king were alone, the silence between them thick and suffocating. Redrick took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. "You," he said, and the single word carried the weight of 7 years of confusion, of longing, of rage. "You're her. You're my—" Elira could not move, could not breathe, could not do anything but stand frozen as the king closed the distance between them. His scent filled her nostrils, overwhelming and intoxicating, and the bond sang with a vicious, triumphant joy that terrified her. This was what it wanted. This was what it had waited for. The completion, the claiming, the surrender. But Elira would not surrender. Not now. Not ever. She tore her gaze away from his, dropping her eyes to the floor in a gesture of submission that was pure survival instinct. Her hands moved quickly, grabbing a piece of chalk from the desk beside her and scrawling a single word on the slate that hung on the wall. Mute. Redrick stared at the word, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held no humor. "Mute," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. 7 years. 7 years I've searched, wondered, mourned, and you've been here all along. Silent. Hidden. Denying me. Elira's hand shook as she wrote again. "I do not deny. I cannot speak. Lies." The word was a whip crack, and Redrick's hand shot out, gripping her chin and forcing her to look at him. His touch was electric, sending shockwaves through her body, and Elira gasped despite herself. "I can feel you," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I can feel everything you're hiding, everything you're afraid of. You're no more mute than I am. What are you running from, Omega? What are you so desperate to hide?" Elira's eyes filled with tears, but she did not answer. She could not answer, because if she spoke, if she gave him the truth, everything she had built would crumble. The silence was all she had left. It was her armor, her shield, her last defense against a world that had only ever sought to destroy her. Redrick stared at her for a long moment, his grip on her chin unyielding, his eyes searching hers for answers she refused to give. Then slowly, he released her, stepping back with a frustrated snarl. "Fine," he said. "Keep your secrets, for now. But this is not over. You will come with me to the capital. You will assist in reconstructing the bloodline records, and you will stay close, where I can see you, where I can understand what the goddess has tied me to." Elira shook her head desperately, writing again. "I cannot leave. My work. Your work is now whatever I say it is." Redrick's voice was iron, absolute. "You are bonded to me whether you acknowledge it or not. That makes you mine. And I do not leave what is mine to rot in places like this. Pack your things. We leave at dawn." He turned and strode from the chamber, leaving Illyra alone with the echo of his footsteps and the terrible, inescapable knowledge that her hiding was over. The king had found her, and whether she willed it or not, her life was about to change forever. The Silent Omega, Part 2. The journey to Blackspire took 4 days by royal convoy, and every mile was a fresh torment for Illyra. She traveled in a covered carriage with 2 of the king's female attendants, beta women who regarded her with thinly veiled contempt and spoke about her as though she were not present. They whispered behind their hands about the scandal of a mute archivist being summoned to the capital, about the king's strange insistence on her presence, about the impropriety of allowing someone so lowborn to travel with the royal entourage. Illyra kept her eyes fixed on her lap, her hands folded, her expression carefully blank. She had perfected the art of disappearing while remaining visible, and she employed every skill now, but nothing could protect her from the bond. It thrummed through her constantly, a living wire connecting her to the king who rode somewhere ahead of the convoy on his black warhorse. She could feel his moods, the simmering frustration, the cold calculation, the occasional flares of what might have been curiosity or confusion, and she knew, with uncomfortable certainty, that he could feel her as well, the fear that never quite left her, the exhaustion that weighed on her bones, the desperate, aching loneliness that had been her companion for 7 years. The bond was a traitor, exposing her to him in ways that words never could. At night, when the convoy made camp, Illyra was given a small tent at the edge of the encampment, far from the king's pavilion, but close enough that she could see the guards stationed around it. She lay awake in the darkness, listening to the sounds of soldiers and servants settling in for the night, and tried not to think about what awaited her in Blackspire. She had no illusions about her fate. The king had claimed her as his responsibility, but that did not mean he intended to acknowledge the bond. Men like Redrick Thorne did not mate with orphaned Omegas who lived in squalor and worked in forgotten archives. He would use her for whatever knowledge she possessed, extract what he needed from the bloodline records, and then dispose of her quietly. Perhaps he would send her to a convent in the far provinces, or marry her off to some minor alpha who needed a compliant wife. Perhaps he would simply have her killed, severing the bond in the most final way possible. The thought should have brought relief. Death, at least, would be an ending. But the bond recoiled from the possibility with visceral horror, and Illyra found herself gripping the thin blanket in her tent, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She did not want to die. She did not want to be sent away. And most terrifying of all, some treacherous part of her did not want to be separated from the Alpha, whose presence had haunted her for 7 years. The bond was rewriting her, reshaping her desires and fears, and she hated it even as she surrendered to its pull. On the 4th day, the convoy crested a hill, and Blackspire came into view. Illyra pressed her face to the small window of the carriage, her heart sinking as she gazed upon the city she had fled so long ago. It had changed little in her absence. The sprawling capital spread across the valley like a dark stain, its buildings packed tight and smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys. At the center, dominating the skyline, stood Blackspire Keep, a massive fortress of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The keep's towers clawed at the sky like talons, and the walls were thick enough to withstand any siege. It was a monument to power and permanence, a place that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. Illyra had been born in the shadow of those walls, but she had never set foot inside them. The keep was reserved for the royal family, the high nobility, and those fortunate or skilled enough to serve them. The slums where Illyra had grown up were miles from the keep's gates, separated by districts of increasing wealth and status. To pass from the outer city to the inner was to cross invisible boundaries that were enforced as rigidly as any physical wall. And now, impossibly, Illyra was being taken directly to the heart of it all. The convoy passed through the outer gates without slowing, the guards snapping to attention and waving them through with crisp salutes. The streets grew cleaner and wider as they progressed, the buildings taller and more ornate. Illyra watched as the city transformed around her. From the working-class districts she remembered to the merchant quarters with their glass-fronted shops, and finally to the noble district where mansions sat behind wrought-iron gates and gardens bloomed even in late autumn. The people on these streets wore fine clothes of wool and silk, and they moved with the unhurried confidence of those who had never known hunger or fear. When the convoy finally rolled through the gates of Blackspire Keep, Illyra felt the weight of the place settle over her like a physical thing. The courtyard was vast and paved with black stone, and servants in royal livery rushed forward to attend to the arriving party. The king dismounted from his horse in a single fluid motion, his cloak swirling around him, and barked orders to his guards. Illyra watched from the carriage window as he strode toward the keep's main entrance, his back straight and his movements radiating authority. He did not look back at her. He did not acknowledge her presence. And yet the bond pulled taut between them, a reminder that distance meant nothing to the ties that bound them. One of the Beta attendants opened the carriage door and gestured curtly for Illyra to exit. She climbed down on shaking legs, her worn boots touching the polished stone of the courtyard, and felt immediately, crushingly out of place. Her gray work dress was patched and faded, her shawl threadbare, her hair escaping its bun in ragged wisps. She looked like what she was, a servant, a nobody, a girl who did not belong in this place of power and grandeur. A steward appeared at her elbow, a thin man with sharp features and a disapproving expression. "You are the archivist from Carn Hollow?" he asked, his tone making it clear that he found the situation distasteful. Illyra nodded, keeping her eyes lowered. "You will be housed in the servants' quarters in the East Tower. Your work will take place in the royal archives, which are located beneath the keep. You will report there each evening after the evening meal and work until dawn. You are not to wander the keep unsupervised. You are not to speak with members of the court, and you are not to draw attention to yourself in any way. Is this understood?" Another nod. The steward's lips thinned, but he did not comment on her silence. "Follow me." He led her through a side entrance into the keep, down a series of narrow corridors lit by torches set in iron brackets. The walls were bare stone, cold and damp, and the air smelled of mildew and old smoke. This was the back of the house, the part of the keep that guests never saw, the domain of servants and laborers who kept the great machine of the court running. Illyra followed the steward up a winding staircase that seemed to go on forever, her legs burning with the effort, until they finally emerged into a narrow hallway lined with doors. The steward opened one of the doors and stepped aside. "This is your room. Meals are served in the servants' hall on the ground floor. Do not be late, and do not waste food. The archives are accessible through the main library on the second floor. Someone will show you the way this evening. Do you have any questions?" Illyra shook her head. "Good. The king expects results from your work. Do not disappoint him." The steward left without another word, pulling the door shut behind him. Illyra stood in the center of the small room, taking in her new surroundings. The space was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a single wooden chair, and a tiny window that looked out over the rooftops of the city. There was a wash basin in the corner and a hook on the wall for her cloak. It was Spartan and cold, but it was clean, and it was private. After years of sharing a room above the bakery in Carn Hollow, even this felt like luxury. Illyra sank onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion and the overwhelming stress of the past 4 days. She had returned to Blackspire. She was living in the King's Keep. And somewhere in this vast fortress, Redrick Thorne was going about his business, perhaps already forgetting the mute archivist he had dragged from the northern border. But the bond did not forget. It pulsed steadily in her chest, a constant reminder of the connection that neither of them could sever. She allowed herself 5 minutes to sit, to breathe, to simply exist without the weight of eyes upon her. Then she rose, washed her face in the basin, and began to prepare herself for the work ahead. She had survived 7 years by being useful, by being invisible, by asking for nothing. She would survive this the same way. That evening, Illyra reported to the Royal Archives as instructed. She was met by the Master Archivist, an elderly Beta man named Corwin, who had served the crown for 40 years. He was kinder than the steward, his manner more patient. and he seemed genuinely relieved to have help with the monumental task of reconstructing the bloodline records. The coup attempt revealed significant gaps in our genealogical documentation, he explained as he led her through the labyrinthine stacks. We need to verify lineages, confirm inheritance rights, and identify any bloodlines that might pose a threat to the crown. It's delicate work, and it requires someone with a sharp eye and discretion. The king tells me you have both. Elira nodded, though she wondered what exactly the king had said about her. Did he know she had spent 7 years cataloging forgotten records in Carn Hollow? Did he care? Or was this simply a way to keep her close, under his control, where she could not disappear again? Corwin showed her to a workstation deep in the archives, a desk surrounded by towering shelves filled with leather-bound volumes and rolled parchments. Start with the records from the northern provinces, he said. Cross-reference births, marriages, and deaths with the central registry. Flag anything that seems irregular, missing entries, altered dates, bloodlines that don't align. The king wants a full report within 3 months. 3 months. Elira's heart sank. 3 months of working in close proximity to the king, of enduring the bond's relentless pull, of trying to remain invisible in a place where her very presence was an anomaly. But she had no choice. She settled into her chair, lit the lamp on her desk, and opened the first volume. The work was painstaking and tedious, but Elira welcomed it. It gave her something to focus on besides the fear that gnawed at her constantly. She lost herself in the faded ink and cramped handwriting, tracing lineages back through generations, noting discrepancies and irregularities. The hours passed in silence, broken only by the scratch of her pen and the occasional creak of the archives settling around her. She did not see the king for the first week. He was occupied with council meetings and court business, and the archives were far removed from the public areas of the keep. But Elira felt him nonetheless. The bond was a constant presence, ebbing and flowing with his moods. She could tell when he was angry, a hot, sharp spike that made her flinch, and when he was weary, a heavy, gray weight that pressed down on her own exhaustion. She wondered if he felt her in the same way, if he could sense the fear and loneliness that defined her existence. She hoped he could not. She hoped the bond was a one-way mirror, showing her his emotions while concealing her own. But bonds did not work that way, and Elira knew it. On the 8th night, as she was poring over a particularly confusing set of marriage records from a minor noble house, she felt the bond flare with sudden, sharp awareness. Her head snapped up, her pulse quickening, and she knew without looking that he was near. Footsteps echoed down the corridor outside the archives, deliberate and heavy, and then the door swung open and Redrick Thorne stepped inside. He was alone, without guards or attendants, and he had clearly come directly from some official function. He wore formal court attire, a black tunic embroidered with silver thread, dark trousers, and polished boots, and his hair was neatly combed back from his face. But there was a tension in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that suggested the evening had not gone well. Redrick's gaze swept the archives until it found her, and Elira felt the impact of his attention like a physical blow. He crossed the room in long strides, stopping just outside the circle of lamplight that illuminated her desk. "You've been here every night," he said. It was not a question. Elira nodded, her hands stilling on the parchment in front of her. "Corwin says you work like a woman possessed, that you've already flagged a dozen irregularities in the northern records." Redrick's voice was neutral, but there was something underneath it. Curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. "Why?" Elira reached for her slate and chalk, writing quickly, "It is my task. I fulfill it." Redrick read the words, his expression unreadable. "Is that all you are? A task to be fulfilled? A tool to be used and discarded?" The question caught her off guard, and Elira stared at him, unsure how to respond. What did he want from her? What answer would satisfy him? When she did not write, Redrick moved closer, his hand coming to rest on the edge of her desk. "I can feel you," he said quietly. "Every hour of every day I feel you. Your fear, your exhaustion, your stubborn, relentless determination to remain invisible. It's maddening." "You're maddening." Elira's throat tightened, and she looked away, unable to hold his gaze. 7 years, Raedric continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. 7 years I believed you were dead, or that you had rejected the bond. 7 years of searching, of wondering, of trying to understand why the goddess would give me a mate only to rip her away. And now I find you hiding in a rotting archive on the edge of the kingdom, pretending to be mute, pretending to be nothing. Why? What are you so afraid of? Elira's hands shook as she picked up the chalk again. She wrote slowly, carefully, I am afraid of you. Raedric went very still. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Elira could feel the bond churning with a mix of anger, hurt, and something that might have been guilt. Then he exhaled sharply and stepped back. At least you're honest about that, he said. Or as honest as you're capable of being. He turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at her. You don't have to be afraid of me, Elira. I have no intention of harming you. But I will not let you run again. This bond exists whether you acknowledge it or not, and I intend to understand it. To understand you, whether you cooperate or not. He left, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. Elira sat frozen at her desk, her heart racing, her mind reeling. He had used her name. He knew her name. And the way he had said it, Elira, had been almost gentle, almost kind. It terrified her more than any threat could have. The visits became a pattern. Every few nights, Raedric would appear in the archives, always alone, always after the rest of the keep had settled for the evening. He never stayed long, and he never touched her, but he would stand near her desk and ask questions about the records she was examining, about the discrepancies she had found, about her life in Carn Hollow. She answered in writing, her responses brief and careful, and he read each one with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Slowly, imperceptibly, the dynamic between them began to shift. Raedric's questions grew more personal. He asked about her childhood, about her parents, about the night the bond had first ignited. Elira deflected as much as she could, but the bond made lying impossible. He could feel the truth beneath her evasions, and he pressed with the patience of a man who had spent years learning to outmaneuver political opponents. One night, he brought her tea, a simple gesture, but one that left Elira staring at the cup in her hands as though it were a live snake. You look like you haven't slept in days, Raedric said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Drink. It will help. Elira hesitated, then took a sip. The tea was hot and faintly sweet, flavored with honey and herbs, and it warmed her from the inside out. She had not realized how cold she was until that moment. Better? Raedric asked, and there was something almost soft in his voice. Elira nodded, setting the cup down carefully. Good. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. I've been thinking about what you wrote, that you're afraid of me. I want to understand why. Is it because I'm the king? Because I have power over you? Elira picked up her chalk. Not only that. Then what? She hesitated, the chalk hovering over the slate. Then she wrote, because you could destroy me. Because the bond makes me vulnerable. Because I have spent 7 years surviving alone and I do not know how to trust. Raedric read the words twice, his expression grave. I could destroy you, he agreed quietly. But I won't. And the bond, it makes me just as vulnerable as it makes you. Do you think I enjoy feeling your fear every moment of every day? Do you think I wanted this connection to a woman who looks at me like I'm a monster? Elira flinched, and Raedric sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not trying to hurt you, Elira. I'm trying to understand. Help me understand. She wrote again, her hand trembling. I was 17 when the bond formed, orphaned, penniless. I overheard the council speaking about removing Omegas with unsuitable bloodlines. I knew they would kill me or disappear me if they learned of the bond. So I ran. Raedric's face darkened as he read, and when he looked up, his eyes were blazing with a cold, terrible fury. The council ordered the removal of Omegas? Which members? Give me names. Elira shook her head frantically, writing, It does not matter. It was 7 years ago. It matters to me. Raedric's voice was ice. "If members of my council conspired to harm my mate, I will see them answer for it. Names, Elira." She stared at him, shocked by the vehemence in his tone. He meant it. He would tear apart his own council for her, for the bond, for the injustice that had driven her into hiding. And that realization cracked something inside her, some hard, defensive shell that she had built around her heart. She wrote slowly, "I do not remember. It was a long time ago. I was frightened. I did not stay to learn details. It was a lie, and the bond told him so." Raedric's jaw tightened, but he did not push. Instead, he stood, his movements stiff with barely controlled anger. "One day," he said quietly, "you will trust me enough to tell me the truth. Until then, I will wait." He left, and Elira sat alone in the archives, her tea growing cold in her hands, and wondered if trust was something she was even capable of anymore. The weeks passed, and the fragile, tentative connection between Elira and Raedric continued to grow. He brought her tea every few nights, and sometimes food, fresh bread, cheese, fruit from the royal orchards. She accepted the offerings with cautious gratitude, writing her thanks on the slate, and he would nod and settle into the chair across from her, watching her work in companionable silence. It was strange and unsettling, and oddly comforting all at once, and Elira found herself looking forward to his visits in a way that terrified her. The bond, too, was changing. The sharp, painful pull had softened into something warmer, more bearable. She could still feel Raedric's emotions, but they no longer overwhelmed her. Instead, they wove through her own feelings like threads in a tapestry, creating a connection that was intimate and inescapable. She began to understand him in ways that had nothing to do with words. His loneliness, his burden of responsibility, his deep, unspoken grief for something lost. And she suspected, with growing unease, that he understood her just as well. One night, as Elira was cataloging a particularly old set of bloodline records, she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. It was a decree, dated 7 years prior, signed by 3 members of the High Council. The language was carefully worded, couched in legal terminology, but the meaning was clear. Any Omega whose bloodline posed a potential threat to the stability of the crown was to be quietly relocated, or, if relocation proved impossible, eliminated. The decree had been in effect for nearly a decade, predating even Raedric's coronation. Elira sat frozen, staring at the parchment, her mind racing. This was the decree she had overheard whispers of all those years ago. This was the reason she had fled, and it was still in effect. The council had never rescinded it, which meant that even now, even after 7 years, she was in danger. She heard footsteps in the corridor and quickly rolled up the parchment, tucking it beneath a stack of other documents. Raedric entered the archives a moment later, carrying the usual cup of tea, and Elira forced herself to smile at him, to act as though nothing was wrong. But the bond betrayed her. Raedric froze mid-step, his eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" Elira shook her head, reaching for her slate. "Nothing. Just tired." "You're lying." He set the tea down and crossed to her desk, his gaze sweeping over the documents scattered across its surface. "What did you find?" She tried to block him, to shuffle papers and obscure the decree, but Raedric was faster. He snatched the rolled parchment from beneath the stack and unfurled it, his eyes scanning the text. Elira watched as his expression shifted from confusion to comprehension, to a rage so absolute it made the air in the archives feel combustible. "This," he said, his voice shaking with fury, "is what you were running from." Elira nodded, her throat tight with fear. Raedric crushed the parchment in his fist, his knuckles white. "These men," he snarled, "these cowards who hide behind legal language and sign decrees, they tried to take you from me. They would have killed you, and I would never have known." He turned to her, his eyes blazing. "No more secrets, Elira. No more hiding. I want every name, every detail, everything you know about this decree and who enforced it. And I swear to you, on my crown and my life, they will pay for what they tried to do." Elira stared at him, at the raw, protective fury in his eyes, and felt something inside her shift. This was not the cold, distant king who had found her in Carn Hollow. This was a man who cared, who was willing to tear down his own government to protect her. And for the first time in 7 years, Elira allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she did not have to face the world alone. She picked up her chalk and began to write. The Silent Omega, Part 3. The names came slowly at first, dragged from the depths of Elira's memory like stones pulled from a well. She wrote them on the slate with a trembling hand, each one a small act of rebellion against the silence that had protected her for so long. Lord Calder Veyron, the High Chancellor, a man with silver hair and a smile like a blade. Lady Morrigan Ashke, the Queen's former advisor, who had died 2 years into Raedric's reign under circumstances that were never fully explained. And Lord Thaddeus Corvin, the Minister of Bloodline Affairs, who still sat on the High Council and attended court functions with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Raedric read each name as Elira wrote it, his expression growing darker with every revelation. When she finally set down the chalk, her hand aching and her heart racing, he looked at her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the stone floor. "Thaddeus Corvin," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He's still in my council. He sits across from me in meetings, advises me on policy, and all this time he's been part of a conspiracy to eliminate Omegas." Elira nodded, her throat tight. "And the others?" "Veyron died 4 years ago. Heart failure, they said. Ashke's death was ruled an accident." Raedric's lips twisted into a bitter smile. Convenient. Both of them gone before they could be questioned. But Corvin remains. And if he's still alive, he's still dangerous. He began to pace the length of the archives, his boots echoing on the stone floor, his mind clearly racing through the implications. Elira watched him, her own thoughts a chaotic tangle of fear and something that might have been relief. She had carried this secret alone for 7 years, and now, at last, it was no longer hers to bear. The king knew. The king believed her. And the king, with all his power and fury, intended to act. Raedric stopped pacing and turned to face her. "I need to know everything," he said. "Every detail you can remember about the night you fled. The exact words you heard. Where you were when you heard them. Anything that might help me understand the full scope of this conspiracy." Elira hesitated, then reached for the chalk again. It was easier to write than to remember, easier to translate the memories into words on a slate than to relive the terror of that night. She wrote about standing outside her parents' cottage after the funeral, numb with grief. She wrote about the 2 council members who had passed by in a covered carriage, their voices carrying through the open window. She had been invisible to them, just another mourning girl in the street, and they had spoken freely, believing no one was listening. She wrote about the words that had frozen her blood. The bloodline purges must continue. Any Omega with connections to the old royal houses poses a risk. We cannot afford another uprising. And then, more chilling still, the king need not know. He is young and idealistic. He would object. This is for the stability of the realm. Raedric read her words twice. His jaw clenched so tightly, Elira could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "They were acting without my knowledge," he said, and there was a note of something raw in his voice. Betrayal, perhaps, or shame. "They used my authority to justify their crimes, but they never consulted me. They never gave me the chance to choose a different path." He looked at Elira, and she saw something shift in his eyes. A recognition, a understanding. "You were right to run," he said quietly. "If you had stayed, if you had tried to claim the bond, they would have killed you. And I would have been too blind, too trusting, to see it coming." Elira's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him that it was not his fault, that he had been manipulated by men far more experienced in treachery than he. But the words would not come, not even in written form. All she could do was nod and hope he understood. Raedric took a deep breath, visibly forcing himself to calm. "This changes everything," he said. "I cannot simply arrest Corvin without proof. He's too powerful, too well connected. If I move against him openly, he'll claim I'm acting out of paranoia or revenge, and half the council will side with him. I need evidence, documents, witnesses, something concrete that ties him to the decree and its enforcement. He glanced at the archives around them, at the thousands of volumes and parchments that filled the shelves. The proof is here somewhere. It has to be. Corvin is meticulous. He would have kept records, justifications, correspondence. We just need to find it. Illyra picked up the chalk. I will search. It is what I do. No, Redrick said sharply. Not alone. If Corvin suspects you're investigating him, he'll move against you. I won't risk that. He paused, then added more gently, we'll search together. I'll come here every night, and we'll go through these records systematically. 2 sets of eyes will find what one cannot. Illyra stared at him, surprised. The king of the High Clans, spending his nights buried in dusty archives, searching for evidence against his own council? It seemed absurd, impossible. And yet the bond told her he was sincere. He meant every word. She wrote, You have other responsibilities. The court, the kingdom. The kingdom can wait, Redrick said flatly. This is more important. You are more important. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Illyra felt her face flush, and she looked away, unable to hold his gaze. The bond hummed with a warmth that was almost painful in its intensity, and she knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. He was no longer just the king who had claimed her out of duty or obligation. He was an ally, a partner, and perhaps in time, something more. They worked through the night, side by side, pulling volumes from shelves and scanning pages by lamplight. Redrick proved to be a diligent researcher, his mind sharp and his focus unwavering. He read quickly, flagging anything that seemed relevant, and Illyra found herself falling into an easy rhythm with him. They communicated in glances and gestures, and occasionally Illyra would write a note or question on her slate, which Redrick would answer in low, thoughtful tones. As the hours passed, Illyra became aware of how close they were sitting, their shoulders nearly touching, their hands brushing when they reached for the same document. The bond thrummed with approval, urging her closer, and Illyra had to fight the instinct to lean into him, to seek the comfort of his presence. She kept her distance, maintained her composure, but it grew harder with each passing moment. Redrick seemed equally affected. She could feel his awareness of her through the bond, the way his pulse quickened when their hands touched, the way his breathing grew shallower when she leaned across him to retrieve a book. But he never acted on it. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply worked beside her, patient and steady, and Illyra was grateful for his restraint. It was nearly dawn when they found the first piece of real evidence. Illyra unearthed a leather-bound ledger from a box of unsorted documents, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting that she recognized immediately as Lord Corvin's. The ledger contained records of bloodline assessments conducted over the past decade, each entry listing an Omega's name, lineage, and a notation indicating whether they were deemed safe or problematic. Illyra's hands shook as she turned the pages, her stomach churning with horror. There were dozens of entries marked as problematic, and beside each one was a note detailing the action taken. Relocated to Greymore Convent. Married to Alpha Jorah Blackwood. Eliminated per Protocol 7. The clinical language could not disguise the brutality of what had been done. These were not relocations or marriages. They were disappearances, murders. And there, near the bottom of the ledger, was an entry that made Illyra's blood turn to ice. Illyra Voss, age 17, orphaned, bonded to Crown. Assessment, extreme risk. Protocol 7 authorized. Status, pending. Redrick read the entry over her shoulder, and the bond erupted with a fury so intense it nearly knocked Illyra off her chair. He slammed his fist down on the desk, the sound echoing through the archives like a gunshot. Pending, he snarled. They were going to kill you, and they marked it as pending because they needed to wait for the right moment. How many others? How many Omegas did they murder in the name of stability? Illyra counted quickly, her eyes scanning the pages. She wrote on the slate, 43 marked as eliminated, dozens more relocated or forced into marriages. Redrick's face was a mask of rage and grief. 43. he repeated, his voice hollow. 43 innocent people, killed by men I trusted, and I never knew. I never even suspected. He stood abruptly, shoving the chair back with enough force to send it clattering to the floor. This ends now. I'm arresting Corvin at dawn. I'm dissolving the High Council and investigating every member who might have been complicit. And I'm abolishing every decree, every law, every policy that treats Omegas as disposable. Elira rose to her feet, shaking her head frantically. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back, and scrawled on the slate, "Too fast. He will know we found the ledger. He will destroy evidence. Claim forgery. You need more time." Raedric stared at her, his chest heaving, and Elira could feel the battle raging inside him, the need for immediate justice warring with the cold pragmatism of a king. Finally, slowly, he nodded. "You're right," he said, his voice strained. "If I move too quickly, he'll slip away. I need to be smart about this." He took the ledger from her hands, his fingers brushing hers, and the contact sent a jolt through the bond that left them both breathless. "I'll take this to my private chambers," he said. "Keep it hidden until I can gather more evidence. In the meantime, continue your work here. If there's one ledger, there may be others. And Elira," he paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers, "thank you for trusting me with this, for not running." Elira nodded, her throat too tight for words even if she had been able to speak. Raedric held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and left the archives, the ledger tucked under his arm. Elira sank back into her chair, her whole body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline and emotion. They had found proof. They had taken the first step toward justice, but the battle was far from over. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of fevered activity. Raedric came to the archives every night without fail, and together they tore through the remaining records with ruthless efficiency. They found more ledgers, more lists, more evidence of the council's crimes. They discovered correspondence between Corvin and other council members, letters discussing the Omega problem in language that made Elira's skin crawl. They found financial records showing payments made to hired assassins, to corrupt officials in far provinces, to anyone willing to assist in the quiet elimination of inconvenient bloodlines. Each piece of evidence was catalogued, copied, and hidden in Raedric's private chambers. He was building a case, brick by brick, that would be impossible for Corvin to refute. But the work took a toll. Raedric grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, his temper short and his mood dark. Elira could feel his exhaustion through the bond, the weight of what he was uncovering crushing him beneath its enormity. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it was not his fault, but she did not know how. So she did the only thing she could. She stayed by his side, worked beside him, and let the bond carry what words could not. One night, as they sat side by side at the desk, Raedric suddenly spoke without looking up from the document he was reading. "When this is over," he said quietly, "when Corvin and his conspirators are dealt with, I want you to consider something." Elira glanced at him, her pulse quickening. "What?" "I want you to consider accepting the bond. Fully. Not as a political arrangement, not as an obligation, but as a choice." He set down the document and turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I know you're afraid. I know you have every reason not to trust me. But I swear to you, Elira, I will spend the rest of my life proving that you are safe with me, that you are valued, that you are more than just a mate bond or a bloodline or a problem to be solved. You are..." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You are the one person in this world who sees me as something other than a king. And I need that. I need you." Elira's heart hammered in her chest. She had spent 7 years running from this, from him, from the terrifying intimacy of the bond. But sitting here now, with the evidence of his sincerity spread out before them, she found that the fear had dulled to something manageable. Not gone. Fear like hers did not simply disappear, but quieter, overshadowed by something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She picked up the chalk with shaking hands and wrote, "I will consider it." Raedric's face softened, and for the first time since she had met him, he smiled. A real smile, small and tentative but genuine. "That's all I ask." They returned to their work, but the atmosphere in the archives had changed. The silence between them was no longer heavy with tension and fear. It was companionable, almost comfortable, and Elira found herself relaxing in ways she had not allowed herself to in years. The bond hummed with contentment, weaving them closer together with every shared glance and brush of hands. But peace, Elira was learning, was a fragile thing. It shattered 3 nights later, when the assassins came. Elira was alone in the archives, having sent Raedric away earlier than usual at his advisor's insistence. There was a critical council meeting in the morning, and he needed rest. She had assured him, via Slate, that she would be fine, that she would lock the archives behind him and work for just a few more hours before retiring to her room. He had been reluctant to leave, the bond pulling at him like a leash, but eventually he had relented, extracting a promise that she would not stay past midnight. It was just before midnight when Elira heard the first sound, a faint scraping, like metal on stone, coming from the far end of the archives. She looked up from the ledger she was examining, her heart suddenly pounding. The archives were supposed to be locked. No one should be here but her. She rose slowly from her chair, moving toward the sound, her hand reaching for the small knife she kept tucked in her boot, a habit from her years in Carn Hollow, where a woman alone needed to be prepared for anything. The scraping grew louder, and then she heard voices, low and urgent, speaking in a language she did not recognize. Elira's blood turned to ice. These were not servants or scholars stumbling into the archives by accident. These were intruders, and they were moving with purpose, heading directly toward her workspace. She turned and ran, her boots slapping against the stone floor, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She needed to get out, needed to find help, needed to warn Raedric. But before she could reach the main door, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the gloom, and he held a wicked-looking blade in one hand. "The mute archivist," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Lord Corvin sends his regards." Elira stumbled back, her mind racing. Corvin knew. Somehow, he had discovered that they were investigating him, and he had sent assassins to eliminate the threat, to eliminate her. The man advanced, and Elira raised her knife, her hand steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. She might be small, she might be untrained, but she would not die quietly. She would not make this easy for them. The assassin lunged, and Elira dodged to the side, slashing out with her knife. The blade caught his arm, drawing blood, and he cursed, his expression darkening. He came at her again, faster this time, and Elira barely managed to avoid the strike. His blade whistled past her ear, close enough that she felt the displacement of air. She backed toward the shelves, her mind frantically searching for an advantage. The archives were a maze, narrow and cluttered, and she knew them better than any outsider could. If she could just lose him in the stacks, evade him long enough to find another exit. But there were more of them. She heard footsteps behind her, closing in from multiple directions, and she realized with sinking dread that she was surrounded. There was no escape, no way out. The bond flared in her chest, a sudden, desperate scream that was not her own. Raedric. He felt her terror, her pain, her certainty that she was about to die. And somewhere in the keep, she knew he was already moving, already running toward her with a speed and fury that defied reason. But he would not arrive in time. The assassin struck, his blade aimed at her heart, and Elira threw herself backward, crashing into a shelf. Books and scrolls tumbled down around her, and she hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. She tried to roll to get to her feet, but the assassin was on her, his weight pinning her down, his blade descending toward her throat. And then, impossibly, a voice rang out through the archives, a voice that was not Raedric's, but was no less commanding. "Get away from her!" The assassin hesitated, his blade freezing mere inches from Elira's skin, and she saw confusion flicker across his face. A figure appeared behind him, moving with blinding speed, and a blade flashed in the lamplight. The assassin made a choked sound and collapsed, blood pooling beneath him, and Elira found herself staring up at her rescuer. It was a woman, tall and lean, with short-cropped dark hair and eyes that gleamed like polished amber. She wore the uniform of the king's personal guard, and she held a bloodied sword with the easy confidence of someone who had wielded it many times before. "Are you injured?" she asked, her voice brisk and efficient. Elira shook her head, too stunned to even reach for her slate. "Good. Stay down." The woman turned and engaged the other assassins who were converging on their position, her sword a blur of deadly precision. She moved like a dancer, each strike perfectly calculated, and within moments 2 more bodies lay on the floor. But there were still more coming. Elira could hear them in the corridors, their footsteps echoing through the archives, and she knew that even this skilled warrior could not hold them all off. They were going to die here, surrounded by the very records they had fought so hard to uncover. And then the doors to the archives burst open, and Redrick Thorne entered like a force of nature. He was in his nightclothes, his hair disheveled, his feet bare, but none of that diminished the aura of absolute power that radiated from him. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, the alpha in him fully ascendant, and the growl that tore from his throat was inhuman, primal, a sound that sent every assassin in the room stumbling backward in instinctive terror. Redrick moved through the archives like a storm, his hands and teeth his only weapons, and it was more than enough. He tore into the assassins with a savagery that left Elira frozen in shock and awe. This was not the controlled, careful king she had come to know. This was the alpha in his most elemental form, protecting his mate with a violence that was both terrifying and beautiful. Within minutes, it was over. The assassins lay dead or dying, and Redrick stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his hands covered in blood. His eyes found Elira immediately, and the glow faded, replaced by an expression of such raw relief and fear that it stole her breath. He crossed to her in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside her and pulling her into his arms. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over her, checking for injuries. "Did they touch you? Did they?" Elira shook her head, her own hands coming up to grip his shoulders. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with shock and adrenaline, but she was alive. They were both alive. Redrick pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair, and the bond flooded with so much emotion, relief, fear, love, possessiveness, that Elira could barely process it all. "I felt you," he whispered, his voice rough. "I felt your terror, and I thought I was going to lose you." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, and Elira saw tears in his eyes, actual tears, from a king who never showed weakness. "I can't lose you, Elira," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't. You're the only thing in this world that's mine, truly mine, and if they had taken you—" He stopped, unable to continue, and Elira made a decision. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in 7 years, she spoke. "I'm here," she said, her voice hoarse and cracked from disuse, but undeniably real. "I'm safe. I'm with you." Redrick stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. You spoke?" "Yes." Elira's hands were still shaking, but her voice grew steadier with each word. "I broke my silence. For you. Because you deserve the truth. All of it." And there, in the blood-stained archives, with the bodies of assassins cooling around them, Elira told Redrick everything. Every fear, every secret, every truth she had hidden behind her silence. And he listened, holding her close, as the bond finally, completely, settled into place between them. The aftermath of the attack on the archives was swift and merciless. Within hours of the assassin's failed attempt on Elira's life, Redrick Hadjau won the entire High Council to an emergency session in the throne room. He gave them no time to prepare, no opportunity to coordinate their stories or destroy evidence. The guards dragged them from their beds in the pre-dawn darkness, still in their nightclothes, their faces pale with confusion and growing dread. Elira stood beside Redrick's throne, her presence a statement in itself. She was no longer the invisible archivist, no longer the mute servant who could be ignored or dismissed. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that one of the Queen's former attendants had brought to her room. Still modest, still far from the elaborate gowns of the noblewomen, but clean and well-fitted and infinitely better than the gray work dress she had worn for 7 years. Her hair was braided and pinned, and though her hands trembled slightly, she kept her chin high and her gaze steady. The bond thrummed between her and Redrick, a constant reminder of his presence, his support, his unwavering commitment to see this through. He had not left her side since the attack, had barely let her out of his sight long enough to wash the blood from his hands and change into formal attire. Now he sat on the throne in full royal regalia, black and silver, the colors of the high clans, and his face was a mask of cold fury. The council members filed into the throne room, their expressions ranging from confused to wary to outright fearful. Lord Thaddeus Corvin entered last, his silver hair immaculate despite the early hour, his face composed in an expression of polite concern. He glanced at Alira, and she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, quickly suppressed. He knew who she was. He had always known. Redrick waited until they were all assembled before speaking. "Last night," he said, his voice carrying through the vast chamber with absolute authority, "assassins infiltrated the royal archives and attempted to murder the woman standing beside me. This woman is Alira Voss, my bonded mate, and she has been under my protection since I discovered her in Carn Hollow 3 months ago." A ripple of shock ran through the council. Several members exchanged glances, and Alira saw calculations happening behind their eyes, political implications, alliance shifts, opportunities, and dangers. But Redrick continued before anyone could speak. The assassins were hired by someone within this council, someone who knew of Alira's existence, knew of the bond, and wanted her eliminated before I could formally claim her. That same someone has been operating a secret program for the past decade, systematically murdering or disappearing Omegas whose bloodlines were deemed politically inconvenient. Redrick's voice hardened to steel. "I have evidence. Ledgers, correspondence, financial records, everything needed to prove conspiracy, murder, and treason." Lord Corvin stepped forward, his expression one of carefully cultivated outrage. "Your Majesty, these are serious accusations. Surely you don't expect us to believe—" Silence. The word cracked through the room like a whip, and Corvin's mouth snapped shut. Redrick rose from his throne, descending the steps with slow, deliberate movements. "I do not expect you to believe anything, Thaddeus. I expect you to confess. Because the alternative is that I present my evidence publicly, drag this kingdom through a trial that will expose every corrupt, murderous decision you and your co-conspirators have made, and watch as the people tear you apart in the streets." He stopped directly in front of Corvin, close enough that the height difference was pronounced, and the older man had to crane his neck to meet the king's eyes. "Or," Redrick said softly, dangerously, "you can confess now, name your accomplices, and I will grant you a quick death instead of the prolonged one you deserve." Corvin's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "I have done nothing wrong. I have served this kingdom faithfully for 30 years. If there are documents suggesting otherwise, they are forgeries, fabrications designed to undermine." "Enough." Redrick turned to the guards stationed at the doors. "Bring in the witness." The doors opened, and the female guard who had saved Alira's life entered, escorting a man in chains. He was one of the assassins, the only one who had survived the attack, captured by Redrick's personal guard and held in the dungeons below the keep. He was bruised and battered, his face swollen, and he walked with a pronounced limp. But when he spoke, his voice was clear enough. "Lord Corvin hired us," he said, not looking at anyone in the council. "Paid us 500 gold pieces to eliminate the Omega in the archives. Said she was a threat to the kingdom's stability. Said the king would thank us once it was done." Corvin's composure finally cracked. "He's lying. He's been tortured, coerced. He hasn't been touched," Redrick said coldly. "I gave explicit orders that he was not to be harmed. His testimony is given freely, and it corroborates everything we found in your ledgers." He gestured to a guard, who brought forward a leather-bound book, the same ledger Alira had discovered weeks ago. "Your handwriting, Thaddeus, your signature, your authorization for the deaths of 43 innocent Omegas." Redrick opened the ledger to a marked page and held it up for the council to see. Here, Elira Voss, age 17, bonded to Crown. Assessment: extreme risk. Protocol 7 authorized. You were going to kill my mate, and you documented it as casually as one would document a grain shipment. The throne room erupted into chaos. Council members shouted denials, accusations, demands for explanations. Some tried to distance themselves from Corvin, claiming ignorance, while others defended him, insisting that the evidence was circumstantial at best. But Raedrick's voice cut through it all like a blade. I am dissolving this council, effective immediately. Every member will be investigated. Those found complicit in the murders will be tried and executed. Those found innocent will be allowed to retire from public service with their titles intact, but their influence ended. His gaze swept across the assembly, and Elira saw several men flinch under the weight of it. This kingdom will no longer be ruled by men who believe themselves above the law, who think they can determine who lives and who dies based on political convenience. He turned back to Corvin, who had sunk to his knees, his face gray and his hands shaking. As for you, Thaddeus Corvin, I strip you of your title, your lands, and your life. You will be executed at dawn tomorrow in the public square, so that every citizen of Blackspire can see what happens to those who betray their king and murder innocents. Corvin opened his mouth, perhaps to plead, perhaps to curse, but no sound came out. The guards seized him, dragging him from the throne room as he finally broke, sobbing and begging for mercy that would not come. The other council members were escorted out more gently but no less firmly, their fates to be determined after thorough investigation. When the throne room was finally empty save for Redrick, Elira, and a handful of trusted guards, the king let out a long, shuddering breath. The rigid control he had maintained throughout the confrontation crumbled, and he swayed slightly, catching himself on the arm of the throne. Elira moved to his side immediately, her hand finding his, and the bond pulsed with exhaustion and relief, and a bone-deep weariness that made her ache in sympathy. It's done, Redrick said quietly, his voice rough. It's finally done. Not quite, Elira replied, and her own voice still felt strange in her mouth, unpracticed and uncertain. There's still one more thing you need to do. Redrick looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. What? You need to formally abolish the decrees that allowed this to happen. Not just punish the men who enforced them, but dismantle the systems that made it possible in the first place. Elira's grip on his hand tightened. You need to make sure no Omega ever has to fear for her life because of her bloodline again. Understanding dawned in Redrick's eyes, followed by something that looked like admiration. You're right, he said, and I'll do it publicly, so there can be no question, no ambiguity. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. You would make a remarkable queen, Elira Voss. Elira's breath caught. I'm not a queen. Not yet, Raedrick agreed. But you could be, if you wanted. If you chose to accept the bond fully, to stand beside me not just as my mate, but as my partner in ruling this kingdom. The offer hung between them, enormous and terrifying and impossibly tempting. Elira thought of the girl she had been at 17, orphaned, alone, so desperate to survive that she had fled everything she knew. That girl would have refused, would have seen only the danger in accepting such a position. But Elira was not that girl anymore. She had spent 7 years learning to survive, and now, perhaps, it was time to learn to live. I want time, she said finally. Time to adjust, to learn, to become someone who could stand beside a king without shame. I've spent so long being invisible, Raedrick. I don't know how to be seen. Then I'll teach you, Raedrick said simply. We'll learn together. Because I don't know how to be a king who rules with mercy instead of fear, who trusts his own judgment instead of relying on corrupt advisors. We're both learning, Elira. We might as well do it together. Elira looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing past the crown and the title to the man beneath. He was flawed, certainly. He carried scars from battles and politics, and he had made mistakes that cost lives. But he was also trying, genuinely trying, to be better, to create a kingdom where people like Illyra did not have to hide, did not have to choose between survival and happiness. Together, she agreed, and the bond sang with joy and completion. The public decree came 3 days later, issued from the steps of Blackspire Keep before a crowd of thousands. Raedric stood in his full royal regalia, with Illyra beside him in a gown of midnight blue embroidered with silver thread, a gift from the royal seamstress, made in a rush but beautiful nonetheless. The crowd murmured when they saw her, this unknown woman standing at the king's side, and the murmurs grew louder when Raedric took her hand in his. "People of Blackspire," Raedric's voice carried across the square, amplified by the acoustics of the keep's architecture. "I stand before you today to right a grave injustice. For the past decade, certain members of my council have operated in secret, murdering and disappearing Omegas whose bloodlines they deemed politically inconvenient. 43 innocent people lost their lives to this conspiracy, and countless others were forced into marriages or exiles against their will." A collective gasp ran through the crowd, followed by angry shouts and demands for justice. Raedric raised his hand for silence. The primary conspirator, Lord Thaddeus Corvin, was executed yesterday at dawn. Others are being investigated and will face trial. But punishment alone is not enough. The system that allowed these crimes must be dismantled. He gestured to a guard, who brought forward a scroll sealed with the royal seal. "I hereby abolish all decrees, laws, and policies that classify Omegas as lesser citizens or that restrict their rights based on bloodline. From this day forward, every Omega in this kingdom is under the direct protection of the crown. Any attempt to harm, coerce, or unlawfully relocate an Omega will be treated as an attack on the royal family itself." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Illyra felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she had dreamed of, what she had never dared to hope for. A world where girls like her did not have to run, did not have to hide, did not have to choose silence as their only protection. Raedric continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "Furthermore, I formally claim Illyra Voss as my bonded mate and future queen of the High Clans. She is the woman the goddess chose for me, and she has proven herself worthy of that honor through her courage, her intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Any who question her right to stand at my side will answer to me personally." He turned to Illyra, still holding her hand, and his expression softened. "And to you, Illyra, I make this promise before the kingdom and the gods. I will spend every day of my life ensuring you never regret choosing to stay, that you never regret choosing me." Illyra's throat was too tight for words, but she managed to nod, squeezing his hand in return. The bond between them glowed with warmth and certainty, and for the first time in 7 years, Illyra felt truly safe. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. The High Council was restructured, with new members chosen for their integrity rather than their political connections. The Omega Protection Act, as it came to be called, was enforced with ruthless efficiency, and several nobles who had been quietly exploiting Omegas in their territories found themselves stripped of their titles and lands. Raedric ruled with a firmer hand than before, and while some resented the changes, most recognized them as necessary corrections to a broken system. Illyra, meanwhile, began the slow process of becoming a queen. She worked with tutors to learn court protocol, political strategy, and the delicate art of diplomacy. It was exhausting and often frustrating. She had spent so many years avoiding attention that being thrust into the center of court life felt like learning to breathe underwater. But Raedric was patient, and he never pushed her beyond what she could handle. When the lessons became too much, when the weight of eyes and expectations threatened to crush her, he would take her to the gardens or the library, places where they could simply be Raedric and Illyra, not king and future queen. They also worked together to reform the archives, turning the neglected repository into a properly maintained historical resource. Illyra hired archivists from across the kingdom, trained them personally, and implemented systems to ensure that records would never again be lost or destroyed for political convenience. It was her domain, her contribution to the kingdom, and she threw herself into it with a passion that surprised even her. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. The initial raw intensity softened into something more sustainable, more comfortable. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs. Raedric learned that Ellyra needed quiet spaces and time alone to recharge, while Ellyra learned that Raedric's gruff exterior hid a man who craved affection and reassurance, but had never felt safe enough to ask for it. They fought occasionally, Raedric's autocratic tendencies clashing with Ellyra's stubborn independence. But they always came back together, the bond ensuring that neither could stay angry for long. 6 months after the dissolution of the corrupt council, Raedric proposed formally. He did it in the archives of all places, surrounded by the records they had fought so hard to preserve. He knelt before her in the lamplight, a simple silver ring in his hand, and asked her not with grand speeches or political maneuvering, but with simple, honest words. "Will you marry me, Ellyra? Not because the bond demands it, not because the kingdom expects it, but because I love you and I want to spend my life with you." Ellyra looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the life being offered to her. She thought of the 17-year-old girl who had run into the night, terrified and alone. She thought of the years spent in silence, in hiding, in the desperate hope that she might survive long enough to find a sliver of peace. And she thought of the woman she had become, scarred but unbroken, afraid but fighting anyway, no longer invisible but learning to embrace being seen. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place in the spring, in the gardens of Blackspire Keep. It was a relatively small affair by royal standards. No more than 200 guests, mostly trusted friends and allies rather than political obligations. Ellyra wore a gown of white silk embroidered with silver moons, her hair loose and crowned with spring flowers. Raedric wore the formal black and silver of the High Clans, but his face, when he saw her walking toward him down the petal-strewn path, held an expression of such open, unguarded joy that it took Ellyra's breath away. They exchanged vows before a priestess of the moon goddess, the same goddess who had forged the bond between them 7 years prior. When the priestess pronounced them married and Raedric kissed her, the bond flared bright and complete, a perfect circle with no beginning and no end. Ellyra felt it settle into place, felt the last of her fear and doubt burn away in the warmth of it, and knew that she had finally, truly come home. The years that followed were not perfect. No life is, no matter how strong the bond or how deep the love. There were political challenges, personal struggles, moments of doubt and fear, but Raedric and Ellyra faced them together, as partners, as equals, as two broken people who had found wholeness in each other. Ellyra never fully lost her preference for quiet, for solitude, for the peace of the archives. But she learned to balance it with her duties as queen, learned to stand before crowds and speak with authority, learned to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics with the same careful precision she had once used to catalog forgotten records. She became known as the Silent Queen, not because she did not speak, but because she spoke only when she had something worth saying, and when she did, people listened. Raedric, in turn, learned to temper his autocratic tendencies with mercy, to consult before commanding, to trust in the judgment of others. He built a council of advisors who were chosen for their wisdom and integrity, and he created systems of accountability to ensure that no one person, not even the king, could wield unchecked power. The kingdom prospered under his rule, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to learn from his mistakes. 5 years after their wedding, Ellyra gave birth to their first child, a daughter with Raedric's gray eyes and Ellyra's quiet strength. They named her Elara, after Ellyra's mother, and she was doted on by an entire kingdom that saw in her the promise of a better future. More children followed, 2 sons and another daughter, and the royal family of Blackspire Keep became a symbol of hope and renewal. But on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the demands of the kingdom temporarily set aside, Raedric and Ellyra would retreat to the archives. They would sit side by side in the lamplight, surrounded by the records that had brought them together, and they would simply be. No titles, no duties, no expectations, just 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen, every day, to stay. "Do you ever regret it?" Redrick asked one such evening, his hand finding hers in the familiar gesture that had become second nature. "Choosing this life? Choosing me?" Elira turned to look at him, at the man who had been her terror and her salvation, her challenge and her comfort. She thought of the girl she had been, running through the night with nothing but fear to guide her, and she thought of the woman she was now, standing in the light, unafraid. "Never," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Not for a single moment. The bond hummed with contentment, with completion, with a love that had been 7 years in the making and would last a lifetime more. And in the quiet of the archives, surrounded by the history they had preserved and the future they were building, Elira Voss and Radric Thorne sat together, two souls, finally, irrevocably home. The kingdom of the High Clans entered a new era under their rule, one where bloodlines did not determine worth, where power was tempered by compassion, and where even the most marginalized and forgotten could find their voice and their place. It was not a perfect kingdom, but it was a better one, forged in the crucible of pain and loss, and transformed by the determination of two people who refused to accept the world as it was, and chose instead to remake it into what it could be. And through it all, in every triumph and every setback, the bond endured, not as a chain or a burden, but as a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when hope seemed impossible, there was always a path forward, always a chance for redemption, always the possibility of finding light in the darkness. Elira had spent 7 years in silence, hiding from a fate she believed would destroy her. But in the end, that fate had saved her. The bond she had feared had become her greatest strength, and the man she had run from had become her greatest ally. Together, they proved that even the most broken things could be mended, that even the most fearful hearts could learn to trust, and that love, true, chosen, hard-won love, was worth fighting for. And so the silent Omega became a queen, not by surrendering her voice, but by learning when and how to use it. And the Alpha King, once cold and isolated, became a partner and a father, learning that true strength lay not in dominance, but in the courage to be vulnerable. Their story became legend in the High Clans, told to children as a reminder that destiny is not a cage but a path, and that the choices we make, to run or to stay, to hide or to speak, to fear or to love, define us far more than the circumstances of our birth. It was a story of survival and transformation, of fear overcome and trust earned, of two people who found each other in the darkness and chose to walk into the light together. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.